Good evening. In just a minute, we'll be ready to begin. Good evening and welcome back. I haven't seen many of you in person since all this madness began, so it would be great to hear from you. And by that I mean, please chime in, share your questions, your comments, using the comment feature on this page. I'll do my best to address them along with the class. So please do share what's on your mind. We'd love to hear. So a fellow asked his rabbi for advice, and he wants to know what's the best food for a patient with the coronavirus. What's the right idea? Is there any Jewish food? Is there any solution? Is there something to serve a patient with coronavirus that would help? The rabbi said, you know what the best food is? It must be matzah. Matzah? Does that have some way to cure the virus? No. I didn't mean cure the virus. I just mean matzah because that fits right under the door. You push the matzah under the door and keep going with the quarantine. But all jokes aside, it actually, seriously speaking, matzah is described in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar, as the food of faith, as well as the food of healing, both of which we can use right now. We definitely need the healing, and we definitely can use a boost of faith, optimism, and positivity. So let's talk about tonight's title, which is Crunch Away, all about matzah. So matzah, this is matzah. This is a box of handmade shmura matzah you have right here, and it's still in the shrink wrap. I'm going to open that shrink wrap, and the reason I'm emphasizing that will become clear as we proceed. So opening the shrink wrap, we have a box of 3 matzahs, just perfect for a Seder. And inside, pulling out the matzah, we discover something interesting. This matzah is round matzah. Kind of little imperfect shaped round matzah. Unlike some of the popular matzah you might find in the grocery store, which is typically rectangular or square. This matzah, what we're calling the shmura matzah, is round. What does that really mean? Why is it round? And is there really any difference between this round shmura matzah and those square, easy to find matzahs, which also happen to be a lot cheaper? What is the difference and why does it matter? So let's go back to the very beginning of when matzah began. We actually have, while the Jews were still in Egypt, and the Torah commands that they should bring the Passover sacrifice. And on that last evening in Egypt, the last night before they were finally freed, they celebrated the first Seder, the first Passover. And that first Passover, that first evening in Egypt, they were meant to eat from the Paschal lamb, along with myrrh, the bitter herbs we eat on Passover, and matzah. So that's where matzah began. But then, of course, the story continues that the Jews were suddenly in a hurry to leave Egypt because the Egyptians, after all this time refusing to let the Jews go, panicked at the final plague, the death of the firstborns, and chased the Jews out. So much so that they grabbed their dough, which they'd been planning to break bread that morning, grabbed their dough, which didn't have time to rise, took it out with them, and it kind of hardened and baked into the sun into a flat matzah. So we continue to eat matzah in memory and in recognition of that, as the Torah commands us to keep eating that matzah and no bread each year on Passover. So matzah is described as the food of faith because the Jewish people went out into the desert, into a desolate place without even proper food. Their bread did not even have a chance to bake, but they knew that God would be with them, and with their faith in God, they moved forward and came out into the desert. So, matzah, the food of faith, had that 2-part history. Matzah that they ate while in Egypt, and matzah that they ate as they exited Egypt and there was no chance or opportunity for the bread to rise. So the original matzah was the faith before the miracle. That was the expression of the faith the Jewish people had that God would finally liberate them from Egypt. That's the matzah that took a lot of effort. They prepared that matzah, made sure it wouldn't rise and turn into bread, turn into chametz, made sure that would be matzah, and that would be ready for the Passover Seder. That was the time of faith before the good news came. The faith where you have to hold on tight and believe. After they were freed, the matzah became matzah on its own. The faith already came naturally to them. They already saw God's hand taking them out of Egypt with all this miracle. In other words, as the Hasidic masters explain, chametz, the leaven, the bread that rises, the regular bread that we usually eat, represents ego, negativity, and really all of that side where the person becomes a little puffed up with himself, and that's where all the trouble begins, where there's a lack of humility, a lack of compassion, a lack of bonding with others. Matzah means we get rid of that ego and negativity. We shut it all out. We actually only have matzah. We only have the bread completely flat, no room for any of that ego, no room for that sense of haughtiness and selfishness. There's only selflessness and dedication to God and to our fellow human beings. So originally, in the world we live in life as we know it, we need to work really hard to achieve matzah. We need to put all this effort into it, get to the point where the matzah is matzah and not leavened bread that rises up with our ego. But when we leave Egypt, when the miracle happens, or in our terms, in our time, when the Mashiach comes, that's when it becomes natural. That's when matzah becomes matzah on its own, just because it had no chance to rise, because the presence of God and the better time and the better reality is readily apparent, and we're able to appreciate that we should not be puffed up with that ego. We're able to really live that better and greater life. So matzah today is an effort. To have that flat bread, no leaven, no ego, takes a lot of investment. But this will bring us to a time when that will come natural to us. So how is matzah made? We have the matzah. You see it's a little bit burnt. You see it's kind of round. It's the crunchy kind. It's a relatively fresh matzah. How is matzah made? So the ingredients in the matzah are flour and water, nothing else. But the process is extremely particular and extremely strict in order to actually have an absolute kosher matzah. Specifically, these are some of the key components. The first is speed. Speed is critical here. The matzah must be made from beginning to end. So that means from when we pour the water into that flour until it's baked and ready out of the oven, all of that must take less than 18 minutes. After 18 minutes, from when the water meets the flour, that flour begins to rise. So within 18 minutes from the first contact of flour and the water, the matzah has to be fully baked. And actually, from experience supervising the matzah baking, I'll tell you, it goes a lot faster than that. But after 18 minutes would have been that maximum. Another component is watching the matzah. What does it mean to watch the matzah? So you'll notice what it says here, Shemura matzah. We can see that, Shemura matzah. What does Shemura mean? Shemura means watched. Shemura means guarded over, watched over, and that's derived from the Torah's terminology regarding the matzah. Ushmartem es hamatzos, you shall watch the matzah. We watch that over. Now it's possible to watch the matzah from the moment you grind the flour all the way through to the baking to make sure that it's not chametz, to make sure nothing happens to it that would make it rise up like bread. But actually the proper way to do that is from the harvest. And even before the harvest, choosing the moment to harvest the wheat depends on the weather that day, depends on a lot of factors. to make sure that we harvest that wheat in the perfect condition, not with no moisture, but not too dry. So that should create the perfect matzah, the shmura matzah, the ideal matzah for the Seder. So we're watching the wheat from even before it was harvested, and especially from the moment of harvest, all the way through to the baking. That's what shmura matzah means, protected, guarded from any possibility of chametz, from any possibility of rising up, all the way through. And a third very important component in baking of the matzah is the intent. We bake the matzah for the express purpose of the mitzvah. The matzah is not baked for fun. The matzah is not baked for some other use. The matzah is baked with the intention of using it for the mitzvah, for celebrating Passover for the Seder night. If you ever check it out in the matzah bakery, they announce it as they work, and everybody says together, this matzah is being created for the mitzvah. That intention, producing, preparing the matzah for the mitzvah makes the matzah special. We can do the same act and it would be mundane. But when we do this act and knead the dough and mix the flour and the water and put that in the oven, do all the steps for the purpose of the mitzvah, that makes the matzah special, that makes the matzah sanctified, that makes the matzah for a higher purpose. Same kind of thing exists in life. We can do the same thing, but why do we do it? For selfish reasons, just because, instinctively, or for a higher purpose that we wish to achieve. When we do something for that higher purpose, we sanctify it, we make it holy, we make it great. And that's what we do with the matzah. So what emerges following all the protocol? Authentic matzah, bread of faith, that the Zohar and the Kabbalah calls michla dehemnusa, bread of faith, the actual matzah made according to the Torah's design and empowered with that divine energy. And that is also why the Zohar describes the matzah as bread of healing, bread which brings healing, which brings not only comfort, but actually can heal someone from a problem, from sickness. That energy of God improves the situation, brings healing, and brings blessing. Doing the matzah right gives it that power, gives it that energy, and gives it that ability. Now, all of this process that we've been describing is done by hand, from A to Z by hand, baked in a hearth, with utmost care and precision. I actually did a run myself just a few weeks ago when we were still able to travel to ensure the best quality and the best precision and the highest possible kosher level in that matzah. I supervised the actual run over in New York just at the beginning of this month. So, matzah is really done in this handmade, old-fashioned kind of way. Now, isn't there a more modern or industrialized way to do this? Well, it turns out that there is. Matzah has been produced by machine now for quite a while. The first machine for matzah production came on the scene in Germany in 1838. Now, being that it was in Germany, which was not where the main Jewish centers were, that started off quietly. But later on in the 1850s and into the 1860s, meaning around the time of the American Civil War, better machines were developed for the production of matzah. And matzah began to be produced in much larger quantities by machine. And this sparked not the American Civil War, but a war of words among many of the rabbis of the time. Some of them believing that matzah by machine was not actual proper matzah. Now, what could be the problem with the matzah made by machine? Why did some rabbis not accept it? What was wrong with improving the process? I mean, 1850s, 1860s, this is industrial revolution. This is the time to move over to a machine-made system. Do this better. Well, one problem could be the chametz quality control, we might call it. When we prepare matzah, after every batch, all those tools, anything involved needs to be cleared off from the first batch, from any bit of residue of dough, and we need to start over. Because if that dough remains past the 18-minute mark when it first hit the water, when the flour and water first met, that dough will ferment and become chametz. So we got to really clean down, and matzah bakeries are built that way, designed to clean each and every component between each and every batch. How do you do that in the complex parts of a machine? So some of the rabbis were concerned that that wasn't practical. And that's something that improved as the machines improved over time. Another issue they were concerned of is the actual fermentation of the dough, which is when it turns from dough into chametz, into leavened dough when it puffs up like yeast as it begins to rise. So we know, as we've been discussing, that from the moment the flour and the water mix, 18 minutes later begins to rise. So we have that window in which to bake the matzah and prevent it from rising. However, how long does it take when you do it by machine? What if the machine is hot, as particularly the early machines were, and they heats up the dough? The rabbis were really concerned that this can create a totally different time slot and a totally different amount of time and process until fermentation would begin, one that we couldn't necessarily calculate, one that we would have no defined Torah rule how to measure, and we would not be able to control and stop the matzah before the fermentation. So that was another reason that there was some controversy over the machines. And again, this can also be something that potentially improves as the machines improved over time. And finally, there's the issue of the intent. So we mentioned that matzah is made with the intention of using it for the mitzvah. It's not made as a cracker. It's made for the mitzvah. It's holy and it's special from the start. That intention is a Torah obligation. The Torah requires that we use matzah made with that express intention. Now, how does the machine have that intention? In fact, even a child, a human child, cannot bake the matzah for the Seder because he's not considered old enough and mature enough to have a proper focus and intent. Now, how do we expect a machine, and we're talking before AI here, but I'd say even with artificial intelligence, how do we expect the machine to be considered intent? The machine has no intent. The machine operates. The machine doesn't make this for the purpose of the matzah. So this was a real issue in making matzah that would be valid for the Seder. And here's where some rabbis said, and continue to say till this very day, that the machine is activated by a human, of course. And that activation made the matzah with the proper intent. In other words, the operator pushed the button, pulled the lever, whatever it was in the particular machine, to begin the process, and he did so. He activated that machine with the intent of creating matzah for the mitzvah. And if so, this matzah was created, was baked, was kneaded and prepared with the proper intent. And other rabbis felt that there was insufficient, and that would not be enough to make the matzah special matzah created with intent for the mitzvah. So this is two ways to look at it, something which remains this very day. But there's something we might be overlooking. Because when we talk about machine matzah versus handmade matzah, and if the machine matzah is good enough or almost good enough or second rate to the handmade matzah, not to, God forbid, disparage anyone who chooses to use such matzah. There's many respectable rabbis who believe it's perfectly fine. But there's something we should keep in mind, and that is the shemura. Practically speaking, when you walk into the grocery store and buy that little box for just a few dollars of machine-made square matzah, and that's where the difference between the round and the square comes in, because the handmade matzahs tend to be round, machine-made matzahs tend to be square. It's one of the easy ways to tell, although it's not foolproof. Those matzahs that you get in that box in the grocery store are typically not shmura. They could have been and still been processed by the machine along the way, but typically at the market, that's not what's there. Those are not matzahs that have been watched from the moment of harvest all the way till baking and beyond. Those are not matzahs where even from before the harvest, we've been focused and planning and making the right flour and the right dough all the way through to the matzah, from the beginning to the end, as is a proper and complete fulfillment of the Torah's mitzvah. Watch the matzahs, make them shmura. And that is why we should all be sure to have shmura matzah, to have the round handmade matzahs, which are the matzahs that are actually shmura, actually watched from the very beginning of the harvest, made by hand. In other words, A class all the way, with no possibility of any deficiency. I make it a tradition each and every year to distribute such matzah around the community. This year, I think I'll have to do it a little bit differently, but usually trying to personally visit everyone at their home or place of work and have at least that one chance to say hello and bring the matzah, bring the actual proper handmade shmura matzah, at least enough for the Seder, so everyone can celebrate in the proper fashion. This is something that the Rebbe called for from very early on and back in the 1950s. Make sure everyone has the shmura matzah, at least for the Seder. Why is that so critical? Why can't we settle for what might be second best? Why do we need to have only top of the line matzah and everybody needs that? Let's go back to the beginning. We've been talking about matzah being bread of healing and bread of faith. The bread that expresses the emunah, the faith the Jewish people had, the trust they had in God in leaving Egypt and all the generations since. The bread that expresses and has the power and divine energy to provide healing, to bring that power and blessing to our lives. Would we settle for second-rate healing? Would we settle for less than the best doctor? Would we settle for less than the best and most powerful and most life-changing faith? Let's not shortchange ourselves on Pesach. Let's make sure we have the handmade shmura matzah, at least for that Seder, so we do that right. Especially this year, when our world is so much in need of healing and so much in need of faith and trust in God, as opposed to panic and despair. So much in need of that extra blessing. Let's make sure we have the shmura matzah and get that blessing right. On a practical note, I have all these matzahs, packs of 3, packs of 6, which I usually distribute. This year, not a good idea to hang around town and go visit people. It's not the way to help the situation. So we'll be mailing out those matzahs. I do want to point out, in order that nobody should be concerned, I just opened this box from the shrink wrap that it was originally in. All the cases we have are shrink wrapped matzahs, and they've been inside that case since they were baked about a month ago, before the emergence of any cases of coronavirus in our area. And they will be packed in a sterile fashion and shipped out. And of course, if anybody is concerned when the matzah arrives, I would just recommend get rid of that shrink wrap, discard it, get it out of the way, wash your hands, and have a pure, untouched, and definitely corona-free box of matzah. Well, let's conclude with a thought that's very relevant, I think, to today and today's situation. This book, it's actually a little hard to see it in that backwards on the video. This book, the Hayom Yom, is the Rebbe's one of the Rebbe's first works, published by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1942. This book has a little saying for each and every day of the year. Let's read the saying for the second day. It would actually be the first day of Pesach. The Alter Rebbe declared, the matzah of the first evening of Pesach is called the food of faith. The matzah of the second evening is called the food of healing. When healing brings faith, thank you, God, for healing me, then clearly there has been illness. When faith brings healing, there is no illness to start with. What a profound idea. We've been talking about matzah being the bread of healing as well as the bread of faith. But the Rebbe points out here that that splits between two nights. So let's remember there are two seders. A lot of people are very particular about the first seder and kind of forget the second one. But there are two seder nights, and we should be celebrating them both. In the first night, the matzah is more of a bread of faith, emunah, belief and trust in God. The second night is when it's more about healing, refuah, the bread of healing, the bread that brings the cure. And here's where the Rebbe explains that you can have faith before healing or healing before faith. But we're very particular. Night number 1 is faith, and night number 2 is healing. Faith comes first. Because if the healing came first, and that healing brought our faith, that means before the healing, there was no faith and trust in God. That means somebody had a problem, he was sick, or otherwise impacted with the trouble. Then God brought healing, and that inspired faith. That's nice, but that means we started with a problem, with the challenge, like so many of us are experiencing now. But if we come on board to begin with faith and trust in God, if we come on board from the very start with the understanding that everything was going to be okay because God is with us, we understand we have to take every precaution, be as careful as we can, but never panic and never despair because we have faith and trust in God, then we don't truly have the problem to begin with. Then all along we feel safe and secure. All along we feel stable. All along we feel all right and okay because we know that God is with us. We know that God is watching us, and this is going to work out the way it should be. So when we have faith, even before the healing, we have the matzah of faith on the first night and the healing on the second night, then we never had a problem to begin with. Even during the disease, even during the pandemic, we had faith and trust in God. We were calm and confident and optimistic, and that bore itself out over time. When we finally reached a better time, we finally reached a cure. If we would start the other way around and only grow to have trust and faith and optimism after the cure kicks in, well, then we truly suffer and perhaps even panic while there's a problem. So the matzah, the bread of healing, the bread of faith, reminds us. Let's start with the faith. I know today, with the coronavirus, we're not yet up to a cure. We're kind of still in trouble. It's actually still intensifying from day to day. We're not yet on the mend and on the part where it gets better. But let's hold on to our faith. Let's start with faith and then reach the healing. And that way, we never have the trouble to begin with. That way, we're empowered, we're optimistic, we're positive all the way through from the very start. We never give up hope. We strengthen ourselves, we strengthen each other until we finally reach that cure. Tomorrow evening, same time, 8 o'clock, same channel here on Facebook and on YouTube, we'll be discussing the infinite fit. Now that's because most of us, hopefully all of us, are spending our time at home these days and staying safe and trying to keep others safe. And that means for a lot of us that we notice, we pay more attention to our home. And that might mean we recognize that some people live in a much smaller or otherwise challenged home, which might be a more difficult place to spend so much time. But we should also think about God's home. God's home. What does God's home mean? Well, in this week's Torah reading, we talk about the Mishkan, the temple, the home for God. And tomorrow night, we're going to discuss how is it even possible to create a home for God? How can the infinite fit in a home? How can an infinite God be expressed and be revealed in this world, in a home, in the home for God, and even in our own homes where we all are right now? See you tomorrow evening, and have a great night meanwhile.